Good morning, everyone. Welcome. This is a first in South Africa that we are having a near-death experience panel with three amazing beings and healers today, and coaches and authors and publishers and literary guides who've been doing amazing things. And all of these people here today actually went through a near-death experience at some point. Some have died more than once, and they will be sharing their stories with you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. What a wonderful group of beautiful beings sitting in the room together. This always makes me and Colleen very happy when we do work like this. My story began about 8 months before I got shot, when I was at Colleen's house and we were having a beautiful dinner, and some armed robbers came into her house and held us all up. This is in Gauteng, and tied us up, loaded everything into my car, and drove off in it and left the three of us, Colleen, Chris, and I, lying on the floor, tied up, and thank goodness the girls were in bed asleep, I think. They were still very little. So that's how this all began. And 8 months later, I was in my own little house, a few plots down from where we were held up at Colleen's, and my friends Charles and Jill were with me, my neighbors, very dear friends, and Jill's brother happened to be there. So it was the four of us, and their two small children were asleep in the house next door. So it was just an arbitrary evening. I just moved into this little house, and the next thing, these three men walked in, and immediately I recognized the orange hat and the hoodies, and knew straight away that they were the same people that had held us up 8 months before at Colleen's house. So already I was a little bit, I'll say grumpy. They are much stronger words. That these people had come to do this again. Now, ironically, Charles and Jill themselves had been held up by the same people 3 months before. So this gang had been moving in the area, all right? So I was sitting there in my chair, and they walked in, and I just felt my whole body slump, because the first time they did it, they took the guns out and said, sleep, sleep, sleep. So you lie down, and they tie you up with telephone cables or whatever they've got handy. And then Charles and Jill had had the same experience a few months before. So by the time they came into my house, this was the third time that either Colleen or me or Charles and Jill had been involved in the same situation. And all I could think was, there are two small children in the house next door, and their parents are here with me. So that was a major sort of conscious moment for me. And then the guys recognized Jilly because she's got this beautiful blonde hair, but like my friend Sarah. And in Portuguese, he said, they know who we are, we have to kill them. And I didn't realize that I'd understood that, but I've been living in Spain for a few years, so I could speak Spanish. So subconsciously, I understood that they were going to shoot us. And as that dawned on me, the first bullet went off, and it smashed the concrete above Jilly's head. She was sitting next to me, and I saw this concrete fly out of the wall, and I realized, okay, they really are going to shoot us. So without another thought, I just jumped up out of my chair, and I just said, I am not going to lie down again. It was this inner sort of lion in me that just said, I'm going to protect my friends. I don't want Nikki and Renee to be parentless. So I ran straight at the guy with my bare hands to try and get him out of my house, because I was like swearing at him, so saying, get out of my house. What are you doing here? This is, you've not, I was going off. Excuse me, I must just get some. So in the moment that I was crossing the room and I was trying to get to this guy, look, I suppose if I'd been any more practical, I would have picked up the chair as a weapon or something, but I didn't think that far. I just went at him with my bare hands, because all I could think of was to get the gun away from him so that at least Charles and Jilly would survive. And as I was going across the room, I could feel the bullets hitting me in my stomach and in my legs. And I couldn't feel the pain, but I certainly felt the impact of it. And then suddenly, just like they say in the movies, everything slowed down to like a very hyper-real, slow-motion moment. And suddenly I thought of everything in my life. While I'm running, and it wasn't too far, maybe 4 or 5 meters to where the guy was standing. And I saw my entire life go before me. And I remember being very relieved that I didn't have any unfinished business. I thought, oh, well, I don't have any enemies. I get on well with most of my family, etc. This is okay. And then I thought, oh, So this is how I die. And it was a very peaceful knowing. I was like, that's interesting. This is not a car crash. It wasn't a disease. This is how I die. It was very matter of fact. And then I also thought, and this is a bit of an emotional part for me, that finally my dad would be proud of me because I died saving someone's life. Because I'd met with 35 years of disapproval at that stage. This was 20 years ago. And so I thought, yes, my dad will finally be proud of me. And so then suddenly all of that stopped and I carried on. Suddenly it sped up again and I grabbed the guy and we were having this whole Bruce Willis movie moment with the gun in his mouth and the gun in my face, and it was all of that acting. And then eventually Charles, my friend, who's a very strong builder, I just saw his hand come down in front of me. So I couldn't understand. I was very big and strong in those days. I was going to gym 3 hours a day. I was an underwear model. That's something you wouldn't believe. Do you remember Bare Undies? That was me. Oh dear. So I was very big and strong. And actually that's another whole story, which is why actually I'm still here. But so Charles reached down and he managed to grab the gun and put it in the guy's mouth, and he pulled the trigger, but it was like right here. And of course there were no bullets left. It just went click. And I actually remember looking up and saying, God, you've got a really sick sense of humor. Like, all the bullets are in me. Like, but I was very weak and I couldn't understand because I'd been going to gym so long. I was actually a very strong man at that stage, and so I was a bit confused. Anyway, he eventually limped out. He writhed out from underneath me, and I remember trying to follow him, and I was already limping. And I felt, oh, there's something wrong. So eventually I turned around and sat down on my dining room chair, and I looked down because I put my head in my hands because it was all a little bit overwhelming at this point. And then I just saw this massive pool of red blood seeping out under my chair on the concrete floor, and I thought, okay, that's not good. That's coming from me. And then I started feeling dizzy, and then the pain started, and then I remember Jilly came in. Her brother, thank goodness, had picked her up and taken her outside, so she was safe. Charles had got shot once in the leg, but it was a flesh wound, but I had 7 bullet holes in me. Then it starts getting very hazy for me, and I ended up, well, I thought I can tell everything, hey. At some point, these 6 beautiful paramedics arrived in their blue overalls and their cropped hair, and I remember lying there thinking, oh my Lord, these guys are beautiful. And then the rest of the story that I'm about to tell you is a combination of, well, let me put it this way. The parts that I remember are the parts where I was myself leaving my body and floating up, and I'll tell you more about that. But all the practical, physical things that happened, I had to piece out from people because like I wasn't there. So they were looking after my body and they were doing all these things. So I can't tell you from Earth's perspective exactly what happened. That's reported. But I can tell you what my experience of that was. So as I continue with the little story, it'll be a mix of both. Okay, we haven't got enough time for me to separate the two. So essentially, in a nutshell, because the ambulance had taken such a long way around to get to the hospital, my friends had all been phoned and everything, and they were all waiting at Sunning Hill. But when the ambulance arrives at Sunning Hill, you can see from the waiting room at the foyer the emergency arrivals. So my friends were already there waiting for the ambulance. By the way, if this ever happens to any of you or your friends, just put them in the car and take them to the hospital. Okay, this whole thing of having to wait for an ambulance, not in this country anyway. So what happened was the receiving nurse, bless her, didn't want my friends to see this. So she pulled the sheet back over my head, but they still, because the paramedics had put that label on the gurney, they sent me off towards the morgue and they sent Charles off to the theatre. But on the way to the morgue, I suddenly woke up. And I saw these lights going down the passage like this, and I sort of shook my head awake, and I don't really remember any interaction there, but they very quickly turned me around, thank goodness, and sent me to the theatre, where I spent 16 hours being sewed up, etc., etc. So that's also in itself inexplicable. That's why I said I had nothing to do with coming back, I don't think. Well, maybe, who knows. So my experience of this was, in the ambulance, I remember so clearly hearing the last words from this physical world saying, we're losing him, more oxygen. And then they grabbed the defibrillators and they started shocking my chest. And then eventually I could see the guys were just crying and crying. And he said, we've lost him. And then they sort of just collapsed. I think there were 2 of them with me. I can't remember. And in that moment, I was floating up above my body. I could see them doing all of this. And I could see through the ambulance. And it was it was very peaceful, but a little bit confusing. I was like, not quite sure what was going on here. But I was very aware that I was above Joburg. I could see the city and I could see these guys fighting. Anyway, so I think the part that most of us are interested in is just the experience of what happened then. So I'll tell you the story and then I'll tell you what I made of it. Very practically, I had a strong sense of myself being myself. There was no sudden mystical change of identity. I was very much myself. I knew I was me, but I also knew I didn't have a body because I could see it lying there. And I got this strong sense that I existed as like a ball of energy, almost like in a big egg shape. And that was quite cool. I felt like, okay, this is all right. And then I started floating up, because remember, no loss, no sadness, no grief, no nothing. It was just peace and a little bit confusion. And then I floated further and further, and I could see the earth getting smaller and smaller. And then all of a sudden I sort of turned around and then I just rocketed through what we'd call it, the cosmos, space, who knows, the universe. But I remember clearly seeing, like in the Star Wars movies, the stars and galaxies and planets flying past, because I was just going somewhere very, very far. And eventually it slowed down, and I had a very strong sense that it's almost like an invisible roller coaster, like you pulled along in a certain direction, and you don't really decide what's going on. You just sort of get helped along in a certain direction. And then eventually it slowed down, and I was like, oh, okay. And the first thing I was curious about was myself. And so it's hard to explain this because I didn't have a body, but I had a sense that I still had a head. Like I could see, or I could perceive is a better word. And I was curious. So I looked down to see what I looked like, and I was literally just this egg shape of energy filled with millions and millions of little lights. And it was quite dark out there. It was black. It was like the cosmos. And I had a moment of thinking, shit, maybe I wasn't so good after all, Like, I'd read lots of books. I was hoping for a little tunnel or someone to meet me or something. But no. So I was a little bit, And that was quite a little bit of a shock, I will say. But then all of a sudden there was this beautiful peace again that says, no, you must come this way. And in that process of me going that way, I just felt this beautiful, loving being pulling me that way. I was more curious about myself still. And I looked at my energy field and everything, and I thought I was probably about this big. But then my senses came to me, and I realized that all those lights that I saw inside of me were full-on galaxies. Not just flickers of sequence, like whole stars and galaxies and systems. And then the realization hit me that we are not confined in any way to these little bodies that we exist in this place. This is a very constricted and a very small world, if you want to call it that. And that our true nature is immense beyond measure. And I remember saying to Colleen once, I think I got the sense that my job, it was very overwhelming. It made me cry, even though I wasn't in my body. I cried and cried at the thought that my job is to hold the love vibration in myself. That's all. That's the only reason we are here. It's to hold love. But we don't know how big we are. So we think we're these little things that are holding love. But actually, our essence is so massive, it goes into the cosmos. So when you hold love in your heart, you're actually holding it for basically the whole universe as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, I just knew I was a little fragmented piece, and it was very overwhelming and very moving to realize, that's my job. You're just here to hold love, which I've discovered after 20 years is actually universal, not just for me, which is rather nice. So then I settled in, because now I was like, I had this very reassuring sense of someone with me, and there was definitely a destination, and then I could stop contemplating, as it were. And then I got a very, very strong sense of we were coming to a powerful place or a powerful sense, and I just can describe it as source. And then suddenly the light and this incredible divine musical light kind of just enveloped me. And words absolutely fail. There's just no ways to describe that except that it is totally free of any limitation. There are no senses that limit anything. You really just know, that you are in the presence of source, the start of it all. I don't know. It's hard to use the word center because it's not really a thing. It's just, I think for my little soul, that was how God put it to me so that I would feel like I knew what was going on. And so I remember being very, what is the word? Like, I felt like, wow, this is big, this is divine. That overwhelming sense of love and massiveness and power and infinite was very real to me. And then there was like a little psychic discussion. There were no words. And I remember, I'm like being called into the headmaster's office now. This is like now I've got to go and communicate or whatever it was. And in that moment, my memory escaped me. It went blank. And so I was definitely in the presence. And I remember, I don't know how long I was there for. And then the next thing, I was back out. And when I say back out, I mean back out of that sort of amnesia into the presence of this beautiful white light. And the only thing that really stayed with me was that I had a choice. I had a choice to come back. In fact, they showed me that I had a few times in my life where I could have opted out when I was very little. In fact, I was born on death's door. And then when I was 4, I nearly drowned here off the coast of Durban and got stung by a blue bottle that wrapped itself around me, so I nearly died then. Then I had a car accident at 18. So I had plenty of opportunities to check out. But in this particular instance, I was very, very aware that I was given a choice. You can come home or you can go back and continue your work. And sometimes I'm not so sure I made the right choice. It's tough. It's tough. I did a women's talk very soon after this event, Women's Day talk. And one of the ladies said, well, why did you come back? And I thought about it long and hard, and I said, for the whiskey and the sex. And I don't think anything's changed. Then the next thing, there was no return journey. That's when I woke up and I saw the lights going down the roof, those terrible neon lights. And the next thing, doing a U-turn, which I later discovered was on the way to the morgue, and then ended up in the theater, and then they put me into an induced coma. What I have realized is that experience, although it was very profound, has not made me any different to anybody else. I'm still me. I still struggle with everything. I still have my heart broken. I still have fear. I still have doubt. I still have to pay my bills. But the one thing that has changed is that my heart is wide open and I've lost all judgment. There's nothing to fear. We all have our stories, and just look at yourself in each other's eyes. Thank you so much.
So I have similarities and differences. I was in a coma for a month and traveled over worlds and realms and beyond. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But the story where I'm going to start it was I was 37 and I was having a bit of a bad year. I was a successful author. I was a multi-published author, and I was running a big magazine stable, 10 magazines underneath me, 2 young children, kind of on top of the world. But at the same time, my husband, my gorgeous, sexy filmmaker of a husband, had been dying of brain cancer. He'd got a tumor at 38, and he was just inching towards 41. And he had decided to treat his brain tumor, along with surgery, radiation, and all the best of allopathic medicine, with Xhosa experience, to become a Sangoma. So he had been walking the path of Sangoma for quite some time, and I along with him. And it was at the very end, It had been 4 years. 4 years of rituals and ceremonies, of MRIs, of earning the money, of being fabulous, of looking after the children, of running a house, taking care of everything. And I was putting a magazine to bed at my very busy publishing company, and I got just a little bit of a sore throat, a little tickle in my throat. Don't worry, I said to my company, I'm going to be fine. Send my laptop to the house. I'll continue working in my room. I phoned my mother-in-law. I said, look after the children for 2 days. I'll be back on Monday. And that is not what happened. What happened was the complete opposite. What happened was my husband, who was already in the spare room on the last stages of his death process, was lying there, and I got worse. So within about 8 hours, it went from a tickle in the throat to a cough. And about 10 hours later, I had checked myself into Constantia Medical Clinic. And that's within about 10 hours of me being admitted, I was admitted into high care. And then I was taken into ICU. And when the doors closed on me in ICU, when I was wheeled in there in nothing but a hospital gown, I didn't know I was going to be in there for the next month of my life. I was in an induced coma, which means I was packed full of drugs. So initially, I was in what I call the world of nightmares, the world of terrible noises and fighting for my life and dying and trying, dying of suffocation and dying on the floor and dying, and nightmares of dying and dying and dying. And then something happened. And that something was I left my body. And then I started to travel. And the first place I traveled was just around the hospital. So I just traversed, I went into, various wards and looked at people. And already, the second I left my body, I was not anybody. I was not a name. I was not a person. I was not a mother, not a wife, not a daughter. I was a nothing. And I remember that being absolutely terrifying. As time passed, I left the hospital. So my next movement, I call this leaving the world of nightmares. My next movement was to shoot out of the hospital and travel on the earth. So I was just all over, like a bird. It was the most incredible experience. I was flying, I was diving, I was swooping, but I was very aimless, very confused. There was absolutely no attachment to the body. In fact, I didn't know the body was on the bed. I did not know that my mother was sitting by my bedside for a month weeping. I didn't know there were prayer circles and Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups, and that my children were desperate and that my husband was dying. I didn't know any of that. All I knew was I was soaring through the earth. But there was a deep need for longing. It wasn't a sense of freedom. It was a looking, searching. And there's one particular part, I didn't recall everything in the book, where I went down and there was family. It was somewhere else in Europe. And I kind of went into the house and tried to be part of the family and tried to belong. But they didn't know me and they couldn't see me, and I was just a nothing. So I knew that this was not my place. And then I went further. The attachment to the earth started to leave me, and I traveled further. And I've shot into the world of spirit, I'm going to call it. It's not easy to use words for these experiences, but I left what is absolutely earth, with horizons and trees and grass, and I moved into another plane. And in that plane, there was a most delicious peace. A group of women, sweet, warm African women, surrounded me, covered in white cloth. And they took me and they said, "You are here to let go. You're here to say goodbye." And I knew that it was to say goodbye to my husband. And I knew he was with the men. And I could hear them just over there, but I could never see them. And they sang and we wept. And I didn't know who I was or what was going on, but I knew that I was there to say goodbye. And then I moved on because I knew I couldn't stay there. And when I say moved on, I don't know if I had conscious will. It wasn't like that. I was just knowing that I was moving. I couldn't stay in places. I didn't see God in that space. Many years later, I've come to understand that we interpret what we see in the other worlds, other realms, through our lens. My lens was shamanic. I'd been very deeply involved in traditional African spirituality. So who I encountered, my safe space, the people I saw, they were those. They were those. And I moved further. And in the physical world, I was deteriorating. I'd been given a 2% chance of survival. I had no lung function. I was on machines were keeping me alive. I'd had a tracheotomy at that point. I pulled my tracheotomy out. At one point, I had been non-responsive, dead for 24 minutes before they resuscitated me. And so I'm told afterwards. But none of this I knew. None of this I knew. The only thing I knew was, is it still on? Was that I was a soul. I was just a soul. And it wasn't wonderful. It wasn't light. There wasn't like a deep, I've crossed the pearly gates, I'm with God. There was just really, I'm just going to say a nothing, but just a little tiny impulse that kept moving me forward, further and further away. So I leave the world of the spirit, the woman, I call it, the world of the spirit woman. And I was sad because there was a deep farewell that had happened. I felt the pain. And I knew it was my husband. And what I didn't know is he was deep in a coma himself at that point, in his very last few weeks of his passing. And I started to move further and further away. And then, very similar to Glenn, I shot out of the universe. And it was just speed of light, just traveling across the galaxy so fast, which felt like for an eternity. No sense of time or place. I can't tell you how fast or how long. The best I've been able to do is track it back with medical records. And I shot into the far ends of space where I was nothing but light. And there was other light around me. And that is where I felt just infinite peace and belonging. Just back to some elemental truth. And then something happened. In the real world, the world of body, by my bed where this body was lying there wasting away, 20 kilograms smaller, tiny, lost all its muscle function, breathing on a ventilator, as they held a prayer circles for me. They held prayer circles. I come from a very esoteric family. My sister's an Osasaniasan. My brother is a religious Christian. I've got friends all over the world. I've been in spiritual communities most of my life. And on the same time, at the same place, all over the world, they prayed for me. They sang for me. They meditated for me. They called for me. And I don't know what happened. But I do know this, that out there in the middle of the nothingness, the first thought in those 3 weeks, almost a month, that entered my being was simple. And that was, I need to go home. I need to get home. And then I think what happened was the fight back was very quick. To wake up from a coma is not easy. It's not anything like the movies. You don't open your eyes. What happens when you come out of a coma is you fight to consciousness and you retract back. So in my book, I write of it as an epic battle. It was a spiritual battle. I did not come back for my children. In fact, when I opened my eyes, finally, they had these photos. They had a photo wall, cards and pictures from all over the world. And there were these 2 children. And I stared at them. And I absolutely knew they were mine. But that was not why I came back. And I only saw that when I opened my eyes. And the fight back was hard. And it was a huge spiritual battle. And I battled to get it back into my body. So I came to a place where I was in my body, in the hospital, and I was aware of that, but not aware because I was still in a coma. And that's when, I'm going to call it a spirit guide, came to me. A man came to my bedside. A small man, putting as a doctor. Neither man nor woman. Small, barefoot. And that was the cue. I thought, why would he be barefoot if he was a doctor? So that my thinking mind was starting again. In my book, I call him the forest man, and he came and he helped me. He said, Sarah, just wait. You're not ready. When you're ready, it will be okay. Just wait. So he was, this terrible impatience suddenly I had to come back to life. He was trying to settle that. And I fought my way back into my body. In fact, it was literally 4 days after the prayer circle that I actually woke up for the first time, and then slipped back and up and back. And then something very interesting happened before he left me in this terrible, terrible world of the ICU, which is like a Stephen King, Dean Koontz horror place of people dying everywhere. He leant down and I asked him. I couldn't speak because I had a massive trachea, but we were telepathically communicating. And I said to him, what must I do? What must I do in this life now? Always. And he leant down and he kissed me on the forehead. And he said 3 words that were the strangest words I'd ever heard. And those were, have more fun. And I completely dismissed those. I was like, this guy's weird. This is weird. This doctor's weird. And then I was woken up. And then I really started to, well, when I was back in my body, I was back in my body. That was it. But I remembered everything. Everything. 3 days after I woke out of my coma, my husband passed away. They did get me in an ambulance and they took me to see him. And I said my farewells. But I knew that I had said my farewells in a different realm, in a different space, in a different place. And and I came back and then I saw my children, and it was really interesting because none of the earthly attachments were important to me. Not my children, not my house, nothing. Nothing was that important to me. Nothing. I was just so grateful to be alive. To be alive. And I went home. People came. They were just so shocked. You know, we were young. We were like a successful couple. We were kind of a little bit of the golden couple. And how was this possible that I'd been dying, he died, and I was back in this body, had to learn to walk again, to breathe again, to sit up again. I'd lost all my muscles. Took me a year, 6 months to learn to speak again. Thank God for SMSs, text messages, because I didn't have to speak. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. And then I remembered, I couldn't forget, you know, everyone was so obsessed with the death, and there was funerals and memorials and mourning, and I never talked about what had happened to me, but I couldn't forget. Couldn't. So I eventually sat and I wrote it all down, submitted it to a near-death experience journal later down the line, and it began a huge journey into asking, what am I here for? What am I here for? Why did I come back? But you know, the human body, which I realize is an animal, the human body wants to live, right? So on the human level, I was just recovering. And on a soul level, it was asking deeper questions. And the sentence, those words, those 3 little words that had been whispered to me, they played on my mind. They played on my mind. Have more fun. How, why? Fun. This isn't fun. Death. Trauma, illness, grief. It's not fun. It's not fun. And slowly, the words started to sink in about what it is this human experience is. It's all the game, right? It's all the game. It's the fun, it's the delight, it's the trauma, it's the terror, it's the pain, it's the grief, it's the loss, it's the joy, it's the deliciousness, it's all of that. And I started to live in a very different way, which maybe we will talk about next. I made some vows and I went on a big journey to understand what it meant to be alive and what fun and joy really meant and how to invite it in my life. And the whole time this was happening, I was already a multi-published author. Everyone was saying, Sarah, you've got to write the book. You've got to write a book about this crazy stuff in Botswana with, you know, all the stuff you're up to. You've got to write the book. And I just couldn't. And when I came out of the coma, they said, come on, now you've got to write the book. And I knew in my being, I couldn't write anything yet because I didn't have a lesson. I was still living it. I was still trying to understand what had happened to me. And a decade later, A decade later, my publisher said, "Sarah, will you write the book?" And I said, "Yeah." And only because a friend of mine had said to me, "Sarah, make something good come of all of this. Make something good." So sharing my story, sharing stories is my way of making something good come of it.
So the word I want to just drop into the space is the word home. Because I think my beautiful friends have given you a song of home, sung through their life stories, sung through their personalities. So mine's going to be a bit shorter, but I'm going to just articulate my song of home. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing. Oh.
Angie.
My great-grandmother, who lived to the age of 99, her name was Ruby Rose McLean, who taught herself to play the piano, who was a very intelligent woman. She said that when I was 4 years of age, she said that I reminded her of the little paintings they used to paint on chocolate boxes, because she came from an era where you couldn't print things, so there were paintings on chocolate boxes. So I had the blue eyes and the peachy kind of complexion, and I was the first grandchild, until suddenly an egg-sized tumor, fibrous dysplasia tumor, grew behind this eye. It threatened to take my life, and it threatened to take my sight. Fortunately, the Joburg Gen those days was functional, and a wonderful doctor by the name of Professor Walker took one look at me sitting in the waiting room next to my mom, and he said, come through, and he diagnosed the tumor, and they scheduled me for surgery in January. I do remember that at New Year's, the year before, I saw my mom and my aunt crying when everyone else was saying Happy New Year, because I don't think they felt like it was going to be a Happy New Year. The surgery was quite extensive. I was apparently the first child in South Africa to have a CAT scan, says my mom. The surgery, now I always say, don't picture this, which of course means you're going to picture it, right? They cut my head open from ear to ear along my hairline. So there's actually a scar just inside of my hairline. Hairdressers always think I've had incredible facelifts. And they literally opened my skull. I've still got the little ridges on my forehead from where they sort of had to pull the face open. And my other joke is that everyone I know calls themselves open-minded, but I think I'm the only one qualified. Now, I don't have a memory of leaving the body or the doctors, all that classic stuff. Sitting recovering in the hospital ward after they pulled all the stuff out of my nose and, you know, the recovery, I was haunted by a memory. And I have a cousin who's my age named Tracy, and they arrived the one day and she bought me a box of crayons. And I sat obsessed trying to draw my memory. And drawing the memory helped me to connect to it again. I wanted to draw a tunnel of light. So I drew these colors and the swirl. And as I was drawing, the drawing was helping me to remember and helping me to access. A 4-year-old mind doesn't have a lot of vocabulary, right? So the only word that made sense and that I clung to was that I had been home. And the feeling and the texture of home is what I was remembering. And more than a story, I would like to invite you to see if you can just feel the song of home with me. Home is a state of being where you are free of the animal body, which, you know, we like our bodies. I don't recommend doing this in front of people, but it's like nice body. But bodies are frightened. Bodies have their own software. Bodies have their own thought streams. Did you know that? Your body produces thoughts all on its own. Whereas now I was experiencing, remembering being free of all of that, being free of this little torture chamber mind, being free of the little monster girl that I had become. Because at 4 years of age, when you walk around with a big tumor sticking out of your face, you can't go anywhere without eyeballs hunting you, without people sort of pulling their children away from you, or pointing and going, "Ach, siehst du, what's wrong with her?" You know. And as an intuitive child, and I'm sure many of you are quite intuitive as well, I was feeling the shock in other people's bodies when I was in the room. And suddenly, sitting there drawing my tunnel of light, all of that was gone. There was just what I call home, and home felt like 360 degrees peace, the same peace that Glenn and Sarah were talking about, and more love than you can ever imagine. More love, the kind of love that burns shame to the ground, the kind of love that fear cannot exist in, the kind of love that just says you are really okay as you are. No trying, no striving, no plus, no minus, no mask. Just freedom, love, and peace. So I'm drawing this and I'm remembering it and I'm looking at my little hands and I remember feeling fascinated by hands. Like, how cool are hands? You know, if you take a moment to imagine looking from your true eyes, the human body is incredibly mysterious and weird and fascinating. I was wondering about how my hands just did this, you know, and the way the little hairs glistened. And when the sun came up in the morning and the usual hospital clanging of bedpans and all of that, it felt like the sun was kissing my cheek the way my mom kissed me. Everything felt like that. Until a couple of days later, one thought stole it all from me. When my mom came to fetch me, carrying packets, and she said to me, "Sweetheart, today's a big day. We're going home." And the little thought dropped into my mind that my real home that I now knew, where you couldn't take your body, where you were free of tumors and pain and struggle, maybe that's also a place that you can leave and you can come back to. Yeah? And the moment I believed that thought, it felt like I fell out of an aeroplane and that I was leaving and losing all the peace and the love, and that I was climbing back in a little dark box where all the insecurity and all the fear and all the shame and all the you're over there and I'm over here and all that humanness came back. I never told my parents, I never shared with anyone that I felt absolutely devastated to be alive again. All I wanted was to go back home. Plus I was confused. We didn't have the internet. Can you imagine that? We didn't have TVs. We got a TV at the age of, I think I was like 7 when we got a TV. And it was the homesickness, as Deborah mentioned when she introduced us, it lasted for so long. All I wanted to do was go home. You might not have had an NDE, perhaps, but who here also feels like they want to go home sometimes? A longing, right? Because you feel like an intuitive feeling, like there is something else. Don't you feel like that? Like this intuition, there's got to be more. Sometimes we say that. And when we look at beautiful scenery, like the ocean, when we hear beautiful stories, when we, I don't know, cuddle a puppy, when we lie on the grass, sometimes we feel it, yes? So at the age of 13, as Deborah was saying, I had become very disillusioned. I'd visited a lot of churches, I'd asked a lot of questions, and we started high school. And even though the tumor was gone, I found myself still feeling like the monster. Isn't that interesting that that happens? We can do our best to hide the parts of us that we think people don't want to see, and all I wanted to do was go back home. And I was lying in bed the one night, and I used to enjoy opening the curtain to look at the moon, because I found the moon quite comforting. And I shouted out to the room, my dark bedroom, you know, if you're real, because now I thought maybe I'm crazy, maybe none of this is true, maybe I've made it all up. If you're real, please prove to me that you're real. Who's asked that? Yeah. And of course there was quiet, silence, you know, in case you think there was going to be a Hollywood moment. So I started crying more, and then there was a peace. And this peace came upon me, and with the peace came another stream of thoughts. Now this is the thing I want to leave you with. Just because thoughts show up in your head doesn't mean they're all rising from the same radio station. And no, this is not a talk about, you know, me, myself, and I. Schizophrenia 101. But have you noticed that some thoughts have a different texture? Some thoughts feel like knowing. When you're arguing with yourself, who argues with themselves sometimes? Who are you arguing with? Or are you the witness of thoughts that are just coming from different places or spaces or perspectives? So I'm lying there, and there's a peace stream of thoughts, and I'm thinking, I want to leave, but I don't want to leave because then my parents will be devastated, and I don't want to hurt them, but I'm carrying this burden of this homesickness. And this thought says, you can leave if you want to. And with this came such peace and such truth and such knowing and such permission and such relief. I can leave if I want to. And typical teenager, but what if I don't want to? And then was this, and this is my question for you that was asked of me all those years ago. Then choose a reason to stay that is bigger than the pain. And it has to be a reason that's true for you. It has to come from the depths of your honesty. Yeah? And I thought about what would make this being brave, this human wild ride, roller coaster insanity worthwhile, you know? And I chose a word that for me meant answers, it meant seeing, and it meant home. And I said that word aloud, and I dedicated my life to that one word. I said, I will stay for wisdom. Because I said, for me, wisdom means I want to know. I don't want to guess. I don't want to believe. I want to know. And I'm very fortunate, and I feel very blessed that that's what my life has been about. In the beginning, I thought wisdom was knowledge, so I read everything, studied everything. You know the story? And then I realized wisdom is not knowledge. Wisdom is clear seeing. And you want to know where clear seeing took me to? It took me back home. Slowly, slowly, I started to realize, oh my word, that home that I was homesick for, it's like one radio station away. Yes, when we drop a body, we can travel. Our souls can travel, for sure. But being free of the body and then the soul adjusting to the fullness of your true I with your true eyes. Your true I and your true eyes is home. And instead of waiting for it, like as if you have to die to have it, okay? Wisdom taught me everything you think you become when you die, you are already right now. I'll say that again. Everything we hope for, everything we think we become when the body ends. You are that right now. It's one radio station away. Imagine that. Isn't that worth the adventure to discover? And some of us, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, are here to figure out if we can do that. Can we climb into this little primate, genetically frightened of everything, with its own FM station, without losing our soul, without losing home? Can we learn to download home into the body to change the way it feels to be human, so that we stop doing this to each other, judging and, ach, sis toch. So that we start seeing home everywhere. So when you see a sunset, when you get a hug from someone, when you feel peace, you're tasting home. That's why we crave it. And isn't this an interesting thought? We all come from different backgrounds. Our bodies have been raised differently, different language, yes? But peace feels the same for all of us. Why? Love feels the same for all of us. Why? Because we share the same home. So that's what I would like to leave you with today. I would like to remind you that one radio station away, just setting your intention to dip a little bit beneath the noisy mind, we can teach our bodies to be home wherever we are, so that we're no longer homesick. Doesn't that sound like a great idea? Thank you.